What Luke says is his face, and only his face, was transformed. And then his clothing became dazzling white. Have you ever overslept and missed something important? Like a meeting maybe, or a class, or you missed the bus? Have you ever gotten to a thing and then you fell asleep and kind of slept through something that you realized was really important and you woke up? Sometimes that happens on Sunday morning. I see some people from up here. It's amazing what you can see out there, right? And I see some people nodding. Some of you know Dan Coker, who was a longtime missionary in Guatemala and just a wonderful, wonderful man. Well, he would always sit on the front pew. Great big huge hulk of a guy. He was from Texas. Everything's larger in Texas, right? Including people. But Dan had this amazing ability to listen to a sermon completely asleep. But he had trained his body to rock just a little bit, right? And so from the back, it looks like he's up here at the front and he's doing like this, and he's just nodding and going along, and he's completely asleep. Well, I heard the story that one time there was a song leader who also fell asleep on the front pew. Just flat out sleep. But he was still sitting up. The preacher who was preaching took a dramatic pause to emphasize a point. At that moment, the song leader woke up, didn't hear anything, and thought that the sermon was over, and now it was his turn to lead the song. So he jumped up and said, "Let us all stand and sing." So everybody sang, and then everybody sat down, and the preacher, kind of startled, said, "Well, we appreciate that spiritual interlude, but let's get back to our sermon." And then they continued. Well, in today's text, Peter, James, and John almost missed one of the most important events in all of history. The moment that right before their very eyes, Jesus was transfigured, and his glory, his eternal glory, was allowed to be seen by humans. I mean, it's one thing to sleep through a sermon, but to sleep through the transfiguration, wow. All the synoptic gospels narrate the transfiguration. Synoptic simply means in Greek it's a similar optic. They all have a similar kind of way to tell the story. And so Matthew, Mark, and Luke are very similar in their treatment. John is completely different. And so the synoptics are referring to Matthew, Mark, and Luke. All three tell the story, but Luke has some aspects that are unique because there's some things that he wants to highlight that the others didn't choose to highlight. The first is that Luke tells us when they went up on the mountain of God, it wasn't just to get away from everyone, to have some alone time, like Matthew and Mark says. It was to pray. And that ought to be a clue for us that this is not the time to fall asleep, because whenever, in the Gospel of Luke, whenever Jesus prays, it's leading up to something important. He prayed all night before his disciples were chosen. He prays in the garden. At numerous points, he'll pray throughout the gospel. And so Luke is giving us a clue that something important is going to happen on top of that mountain. Now, the event is called the Transfiguration. And in Matthew and Mark, the actual word transfiguration appears. It's a Greek word. Some of you have known about it and learned about it and actually did experiments about it back in school, in science classes. Metamorphosis, that is literally the Greek word that is used in Matthew and Mark for transfiguration. But Luke doesn't use it. In fact, Luke doesn't say that he was transfigured. What Luke says is his face, and only his face, was transformed. And then his clothing became dazzling white. Dazzling white. Can you imagine trying to capture the light of a ray of lightning and have that light continue for a minute? We wouldn't be able to look at it. It would be so bright. That's the kind of light that was radiating from Jesus on top of this mountain. The last thing that we find in Luke and not in the other Gospels is that the disciples fell asleep. They did wake up in time to see Jesus talking with Moses and Elijah. All three Gospels mention that Moses and Elijah were there with Jesus, but only Luke tells us what they were talking about, and we'll get to that in just a second. The Transfiguration on top of the mountain is the second of two times where a voice from heaven speaks directly to and about Jesus. The first time was his baptism, and that voice was spoken to Jesus to confirm, "You are my beloved Son, in you I am well pleased." Now we have a voice directed to the disciples about Jesus. "This is my Son, listen to him." The presence of Moses and Elijah also ramps this up as a special moment. We don't have Old Testament characters showing up in New Testament events very frequently. But all this is pointing to a one in a lifetime, one in a period of the entire history where the glory of God is revealed in a way that can be observed differently than what we might have seen before. If you think about the Old Testament, the glory of God would appear, but it would show up as a cloud. It would show up as a pillar of a cloud, a pillar of a cloud during the day, or a pillar of fire. It would show up in an earthquake or lightning. But here we have the very glory of God showing through Jesus. The word glory in Hebrew is kabod. And here we have the kabod of God shining through Jesus, his very nature. This is who he was before he came to earth, and this is who he will be after he leaves this earth. The eternal splendor of God, right in their presence, something that no one could ever imagine taking place. And it was so surprising and so jarring that when these disciples woke up, Peter didn't know what to say. Now, he has that problem, foot and mouth disease. I've been thinking about SNL. They had their 50th anniversary, Saturday Night Live, and they were reviewing some of the not ready for prime time players. That's what they called all those Eddie Murphy and all Chevy Chase and all those guys. Well, I like to refer to these disciples as not ready for prime time disciples because it's almost comical. It's almost comical. Peter wakes up, is rubbing his eyes, all of a sudden sees Jesus dazzling white, sees these other two figures that are identified. We don't know exactly how he knew, but as Moses and Elijah. And he thinks, man, what a good boy am I. He put his thumb, pulled out a plum, and little Jack Horner, little Peter, Simon Peter, thought, man, I'm the greatest, luckiest guy in the world. I want to stay here forever. Let's make 3 little shelters. Well, God didn't think that was such a good idea. He covers the mountaintop with a cloud that terrorized the disciples. Moses and Elijah disappear. All that's left is Jesus, and the rebuke from heaven is, "This is my Son, listen to him." Don't worry so much about Moses. Don't worry so much about Elijah. Listen to Jesus. All that's missing is for God's hand to come down and smack Peter upside the head. Luke tells us what Jesus, Moses, and Elijah were talking about. We don't know. We know something. Now, Moses and Elijah, why not David or Joseph? He would have been a good person to come back and talk to. We can think of any number of people that might have been better, but God chooses Moses and Elijah because they represent, what we surmise is they represent the law and the prophets. Numerous times throughout the Old Testament and then through the New Testament, Jesus indicates that he came to fulfill everything that was written about him in the law and the prophets. The Old Testament has three sections. The Hebrew Bible has three sections: the law, the prophets, and the writings. The most important was the law and the prophets. And so it seems that Moses is representing the law, Elijah is representing the prophets, and the two of them together are encouraging Jesus to stay the course. There seems to be a moment in Jesus' life where he's reevaluating his mission and his direction. He's just announced that he's going to Jerusalem to die, to be crucified, to be killed. You know, we all know up here, we all know we're going to die. I hope I haven't spoiled the ending for anybody. But none of us thinks it's going to happen to us. And we definitely don't think it's going to happen tomorrow or next week. But what if you knew it was going to happen in 3 weeks? What if you knew it was going to happen on April 1st? And that's not an April Fool's. How would you feel about your life? How would you go through these next days? Would it cause you to wonder, to doubt, to reflect? Jesus has just announced his death in Jerusalem. And God sees fit to send Moses and Elijah to say, Jesus, you are doing everything that's been written about you. You are on track. Stay true to the mission. Don't lose hope. Don't lose sight. Keep the mission in mind. And so the rest of the Gospel of Luke until chapter 19, when he's arrested and then begins the process of the trial and the crucifixion, is about Jesus getting ready to get to Jerusalem. But even once he's there, he has another moment. He goes to the garden, you remember, and prays 3 times, Lord, if it's possible, if there's any way, take this cup from me. 3 times. And so I think Moses and Elijah are there to encourage. Now, the way it's described, and I don't know if you caught this when Lucas was reading, the way it's described in verse 31 of Luke 9, Moses and Elijah are talking with Jesus, and they were speaking about his exodus from this world. That's the word that's chosen. That's the word that's used, exodus. Luke is the only one that calls it an exodus. And that takes us back to the book of Exodus, literally. Remember what the Exodus was. It was the moment for the Jewish people, the most important moment in their history, their defining moment. That's when their calendar began. That's when their life began as a nation. That's when God rescued and saved them by his powerful, mighty hand. That was the most important date or event in all of Jewish history. And now Jesus is saying his departure is his exodus or our exodus. See, what he's saying is that Jesus is leading his people out of a place of slavery to the promised land. Now, when we think about the Jewish people, we understand that they were in slavery in Egypt. But do you see yourself in slavery today? Well, we are. We're enslaved to sin. We're enslaved to death. We're enslaved to sickness. We're enslaved to the powers that govern our lives, to the governments that be. We're enslaved to the political and the economic and whatever other systems that you might want to describe. We are living in a world of slavery, and Jesus came to take us out of this world and take us to the promised land. The difference and the challenge is that when God freed the Israelite slaves in Egypt, they didn't stay living in Egypt. But God has freed us from slavery of this world, but we're still here. Our exodus will come a little bit later. And we see that when they come off the mountain. Can you imagine the whiplash that these disciples must have felt? I mean, they were on the mountaintop with Jesus and they come down and now they're in chaos. There's a kid who's foaming at the mouth and he's thrashing around and no one can control him. It's like the world has gone crazy. I imagine the disciples wanted to climb back up the mountain and get back up there in that sweet, silent place. But that's not what they're called to. They've been called to be transformed and changed people in this world as we wait for our time to leave this world of sin and death. So when I think about the Exodus, I don't think it's just for Jesus or just for Peter, John, and James. I think it's for us too. And I kind of see, I don't know how you feel about it, but I kind of see Sundays as a mountaintop kind of experience where we come together to pray, to praise God. It's where we hug each other and we handshake and we feel so good in one another's presence and we're praising God and singing songs and we enjoy being together. But then Sunday's over. And then Monday morning comes. And with Monday morning comes traffic and school and work and the conflicts that we experience in all of those different contexts. We might put off thinking about our medical situation for a little bit, but Monday we're at the doctor. And during the week we have our tests. The only way for us to really function in this world, I think, is to live as transformed and changed individuals who recognize that Jesus has already begun the process of our exodus. We need his supernatural presence to power us through the week, just as the disciples needed that mountaintop experience to power them through the rest of their ministry. But Jesus gets on their case. He rebukes them for their lack of faith. John Berridge said, in the Gospels, Jesus often rebukes weak faith, but he never rejects it. Hear that. Jesus rebukes weak faith. He wants something different. But if that's all the faith you have right now, Jesus will take it. And he will not reject you. And what he hopes is that you will be transformed. In Romans 12, Paul talks about how we're transformed. And in 2 Corinthians 3, Paul talks about how we're transformed degree by degree, just a little bit at a time, until we come to that perfection. And folks, let me tell you, the world needs transformed and changed lives. Our jobs need people who have been transformed. Our families need transformed and changed lives. Our church needs transformed and changed lives. And so, how do we get there? The voice from heaven says, listen to Jesus. That's it. Listen to Jesus. So let me ask you, what is Jesus saying to you today? What promise, what word is Jesus telling you? Listen to his promise that he'll forgive your sins. Listen to his words where he says that I will never abandon you and I will always be with you, Emmanuel, even through the darkest and most difficult moments. Hear his invitation to find rest for your souls. Listen to his command to love God first, but then immediately after, love your friends and your neighbors and your enemies. Listen to his reminder that his power is made perfect in our weakness. Listen to his exhortation to leave bitterness behind and find joy in him. And listen to his rebuke of something you're doing that's wrong, that you know is wrong, that you need to leave. Hear his word that if you continue in that, you will die in your sin and change what's happening. Have you ever known someone named Ichabod? I think a lot of us think about Ichabod Crane, right? Legend of Sleeping Hollow. Well, that name actually comes from 1 Samuel. And there was a lady who had a child, and at the moment the child was born, the presence of the Lord, the kabod of the Lord, the glory of God left Israel because of their sinfulness, and the child was born. And so she calls her son Ichabod. Because in Hebrew, to negate something, you put an E in front of it, or an I. So Ichabod means no glory. No glory of God. I don't know if there are times you feel like God's glory and his presence have left you. But there's nobody here named Ichabod. And there's nobody in God's church named Ichabod. The people in God's church are named Christians because we hear and we obey Jesus' word. If you're struggling and you feel like an Ichabod today, we want to pray for you. Jeff is going to come and pray in just a second. If there's anything we can do during the week, please call, text, email, send a smoke signal. Let us know. We'd love to enter into a conversation with you. We are Christians because we have seen the transformed Jesus. We're not Ichabods because we have seen the glory of the Lord.